Welcome and thanks for coming to the fourth labor session of this conference. My name is Owen Ozier. I'll be chairing. Today we have four presentations. The first from Patrizio Piraino and followed up with Nick Buehren, Aya Suzuki, and a last one from myself. So Patrizio, if you'd like to come on up, we'll do the usual format.
Thank you very much. My name is Patrizio Piraino. I'm from the University of Cape Town. This is joint work with Murray Labrand, also at UCT, and Neil Lloyd, who's a PhD student in University of British Columbia. So this is actually a very simple paper, a modest paper, if you will. We have two observations on the same variable from two data sets, and we compare whether standard sectoral wage gaps estimates differ depending on the wage variable we use. That's really all we do. The paper adds to this fairly large literature on labor market segmentation and mostly in emerging and low-income economies. There are different questions in this literature. Some have to do with trying to explain the size of the sector. South Africa is generally used as an interesting case. I'll say a little more about that in a second. And a subset of this literature simply focuses on estimating these wage gaps, so a wage premium or wage penalty for the informal sector. And that's where we come in. It's kind of important to know the wage gaps because there are different theories of why people work in the informal sector. And so if there is a premium controlling for all the possible characteristics, then there are some alternative theories of informal sector participation as a choice rather as a sort of forced alternative. So yeah, what I said, we investigate whether measuring earnings in a different way for one subgroup of the informal sector, which is the informally self-employed, whether a different earning measures for this particular subgroup changes the estimates of the wage gap. We can do this because there is this survey of employers and self-employed, which is done, I think, every 4 years in connection with the QLFS. So essentially, the same people who in the QLFS state they are either on-account workers or business owner, non-VAT registered, they're then re-interviewed a week later with many more questions on their business. Hence the different variables. Just to give you some context, although maybe in this crowd it wouldn't be so necessary, South Africa is characterized by high chronic unemployment, very high wage inequality. My co-author Murray Labrand has shown in several papers that wage inequality is a main component of total inequality in South Africa. And as I said earlier, there is a relatively low informal sector participation compared to other middle-income countries. There's a number of explanations out there why that might be the case. Have to do with regulation and historical background of the country. And this consistency between high unemployment and low informal activity sparks interest in these kind of questions. And this is not just a research interest, it also arguably even more so recently, a discussion at the government level, at the policy level. The current development plan, for instance, looks at this employment capacity of small and medium enterprises, including the informal sector. So if we are to rely on the informal sector as a job creation engine, then it's probably good to know what we're talking about. Very briefly, there is a number of papers, I'm just quoting 4 here, on this estimation of the formal sector premium in South Africa. One thing, there's a couple of things that I want to stress. One is that results may change depending on the definition of the sector, and the definition of the sector sometimes depends on the data people are using. So by working on this paper, one also realizes that in theory one could spend a lot of time just replicating former papers and changing definitions. That's not what we did, but it's important to keep this in mind as it may explain some of the difference in the results. What the literature shows over time is that if you can, by using the panel structure of the QLFS, if you can control for time invariant characteristics as much as you can, then some of these premiums go down, which means that there is selection into sectors, perhaps unsurprisingly. One thing that is particularly relevant for our purposes is this evidence of a premium at the top of the distribution for the informally self-employed. Essentially conditioning on the job and individual characteristics, there may be an advantage in being in the informal sector when you're self-employed. And we're going to try to see if that stays. This result is confirmed when using our arguably more detailed earnings data. All right, so the quarterly labor force survey is the sort of the main labor market survey data in South Africa. Here we're going to use two waves, second and third quarter of 2013, and we're going to condition on being employed in both waves. The survey of employers and self-employed took place in the third quarter, and as I said earlier, it re-interviewed people who declared were owner of a non-registered business. So because it excludes employees of non-registered businesses, this is best understood as an informal enterprise survey. The good thing is that we can match one-to-one with the survey's responses these people have given a week earlier in the standard LFS. So we look at, we divide the sample in 5 sectors. Formal, there's 3, wage employed, public and self-employed, and informal is wage employed and self-employed. Today I'm just going to focus on the last one, which is the one which is our main interest because that's where we have better data. And we exclude, at least for now, unpaid workers, agricultural workers, and domestic workers due to some institutional peculiarities in the way those markets work. This is just some raw gaps. I guess this is without conditioning for anything. You can see the sort of standard gap for the informal sector when it comes to wages. Now, here's sort of the central point. The QLFS asks people to declare earnings after expenses, self-employed people. One thing that we show, not in the version, unfortunately, that the discussant is going to discuss, we show is that there is some rescaling bias in this data. So essentially, people are given the option to report their earnings in a time frame of their choice, so weekly, monthly, annually. And the shorter the time frame they report, the higher their wages seem to be. Now, partially this may due to the fact that Stats SA does not report the original amount, but reports the risk-scaled amount on a monthly level, at least the data we have. And we show that when you control for this risk-scaling, because we know the frequency of the reporting, we just don't know the amount, a lot of these differences go away. So it seems to be that this risk-scaling is really explaining a good portion of these differences. Now, we argue that the other data is actually, it may be preferable because it's a separate survey that happens on a separate occasion, and it's all about their business. So there is probably more attention, it's not coming after other questions, so people, we argue, are more focused on actually answering the questions about their business. And we construct 5 different types of earnings, so to speak, data, some based on profit, some based on what they declare their own wage is, and some combination of the two. To give you an idea, you see this is the QLFS, the green one is the QLFS distribution, and these are the other series which overlap a little more. So just from this density, you can see that the QLFS responses tend to be higher than the survey of employer and self-employment. Just focusing on let's start with column 1. Just focusing on the self-employed, informally self-employed. This is a simple OLS regression controlling for cross-sectional job and individual characteristics. Importantly, firm size, which explains a lot of these gaps. You see that when you do this conditional gap estimation, on average, informally self-employed people are indistinguishable from the wage employed, which is the formal wage employed, which is the base category. But this average zero actually masks some differences across the distribution. These are just quantile regression estimates. So you see that at the bottom you have a penalty, and at the top you have a premium. When you control for time invariant characteristics using a method which is sort of a two-stage method, in the first stage you estimate fixed effects in a standard way. Then you adjust the earnings in the second stage to run these quantile regressions. This has been used in two of those papers that I was quoting earlier, in fact also using South African data. This is not a method without issues. I mean, you have to assume that the fixed effect is a pure location shift, so essentially the effect is the same across the distribution, which may not be a very digestible assumption. To the extent that these fixed effects control for some of these unobserved characteristics, you see that this, the pattern of negative at the bottom and positive at the top is still there, but now possibly because we have taken away some of these unobserved differences, the magnitude is a little smaller. And this is just using the QLFS. We haven't done any correction to the earnings yet. Interestingly, for that premium at the top that I was talking about before, we confirmed this study, the finding from the previous study. So around 10, they find 12%, we find 10% premium at the top of the distribution for the informally self-employed. Now, I'm going to show you cross-sectional estimates when we use our, here I'm just going to show you one of the series, but we ran in the paper some robustness tests, and the main story is actually quite robust. So you see that at the mean, that zero, so you compare this to this, it's actually becomes a very large negative penalty. And while this penalty goes down, so essentially the informally self-employed are a little better off at the top, but this premium there is no longer existent. We have, sorry, I should compare to this one. This premium there is no longer existent. We actually have a negative penalty. Now, we are also replicating this part using the SESI adjustment. Why I'm not presenting results, because and that's where I'm really hoping to get some feedback, because we have a bit of an issue here, right? So we need this first stage fixed effects estimation, and the SESI is a cross-section. So here you can do two ways. You can get your fixed effects estimates from the QLFS panel, and then in the second stage, adjust your SESI wage by that with a set of assumptions on how the measurement error behaves. Or you can impose a panel in which in the first wave you get information from one data set, in the second wave you get it from another data set, and estimate the fixed effects from there. I can tell you from our preliminary regressions that the results at the top are unchanged, but at the bottom they do change, which probably says something about the nature of the measurement error. In fact, we're thinking maybe that could be a contribution of the paper in terms of how the measurement error behaves at different parts of the distribution. But the overall point that we think this simple descriptive analysis is showing is that maybe this idea that the informally self-employed are doing well in South Africa at the top may be due to the way the question is asked in the standard survey. And this may have implication for other labor market analysis in South Africa, but also in other countries where this is the way things are asked. So I guess our bottom line is when we move into informal sector, especially the self-employed, it may be worth investing a little more time and money on asking questions in a more detailed way. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrizio. Let's see. So to review, there are a couple of, I think, interesting things in this paper. As you said, there's a very specific contribution here. And the contribution is related to measurement. How you measure a variety of things, whether in a developing country or in a wealthy country, really does matter for the type of statistics that you'll get out of that. And then you're using this fixed effects methodology to kind of take us to the frontier of what we can get from this kind of data set without a natural experiment or some sort of other source of exogenous variation. So I'm going to just make a few comments and then see where the discussion goes from there. The first thing I wanted to say is just, it seems like you're developing this paper now, it's still in progress, so I wanted to say I think you're very well connected to the literature on this specific measurement, the question of how do you determine what the premium or penalty is for being in the formal or informal sector. But I think there's a broader literature on how you measure anything in a survey and how variations in that really do affect your conclusions. So the Living Standards Measurement Surveys team, Kathleen Beagle, Jed Friedman, a variety of co-authors, I think Peter Sir-Niels is here, who's also worked on this. How you measure these things really does matter, and so I think you could connect your paper to that literature. And then since the specific area of interest in this paper is the formal sector versus informal sector difference, and you focus on basically micro-enterprise profits. David McKenzie has this work on how you calculate micro-enterprise profits. So you showed this sort of method 5 of the sort of 5 ways you could get information from the survey of employers and the self-employed, I forget. So I was curious how it worked with some of the other methods to connect it to his work. I think there are a couple of minor points, but I think you raised an interesting technical question, and I think you'd probably, and so the technical question was, here's what's nice about the fixed effects estimator. You have a fixed effect, as I understand it, for the individual, and then you observe that same individual across time being either in the formal or the informal sector. And so within individual, you can now estimate whether there is a premium, because there's surely a lot of ability bias if you are just going to look in the cross-section. So that's what's nice about the fixed effects estimator. And then the problem that you have is that the better methodology that's in this survey, the SESE, for capturing microenterprise, you only have one round for. But it seems to me that, so then to pool that with the QFLS data from the previous round might get you into trouble, except that if you've got transitions from the formal sector in the QFLS, where you don't have better measurement in the SESE, if you restricted attention to those, I think you could still use the fixed effects estimator. So that's the suggestion I have for you there. I can talk about some of these other minor points, but if you want to say anything about what I've said, and then we'll go to discussion from the audience. You can even stay here or there, whatever you want to be.
Is this thing going? Anyway, so thank you very much. Especially the last point, extremely useful. We didn't think about that, so thank you so much. And also the link to the broader literature, as you say, we started with a narrow interest in this South African literature, so to speak. So, but that's, especially when it comes to the profits, I'm perfectly happy to look at that. In fact, we may have a separate contribution there as well. So it will be essentially a measurement error paper, not only for the formal informal sector gap, but in general for this type of micro enterprises. It sounds extremely good idea. Thank you so much. Yeah.
So let's turn it over to the audience. Questions? Question over here. Now let's just do it one at a time. Let's ask a question, hear the answer, and kind of go on like that. So Francis, go ahead.
Okay, so thank you very much. That's absolutely fascinating. If you're right, it might explain why the self-employment sector in South Africa is so small. So I've got sort of 2 specific things. You're trying to get at this premium, and your controls matter. And what we know about the self-employed is that the scale at which you can operate among the self-employed matters enormously. So how much can you control for the type of self-employed enterprise that you're looking at? Is it a known trader, or is it somebody who is employing people? I think that's going to matter enormously in terms of picking up this premium. And I mean, the The other point is what do you mean by profit? So I think you'd started talking about whether you took the wage out of the self-employment enterprise. And it seems to me that what the profit number is, at least when measured from micro-enterprises, it combines three things. It combines labor, it combines physical capital, and it combines human capital. And if you want to know deeper as to what's going on in terms of what's driving these differences, you need to be thinking about those measures as differentially affecting the returns to those components. I mean, if you're looking at an individual wage, you know that's the wage, that's the labor plus human capital. The problem with your micro enterprise profits is you've got physical capital in there, and physical capital is what's driving a lot of the heterogeneity.
I think the chair wants us to do one-to-one,
Yeah,
which is...
good to have the microphone.
Thanks for the suggestion about the variables about the type of employee. I think we have actually quite a bit of information in the survey. Regarding the profits, that's why we have these 5 different measures. And in some of them, we combine them to create a sort of overall profit plus earnings measure. What happens is that we need to be careful because we could have exponential number of measure because sometimes it is clear from the pattern in the survey that people are reporting profits rather than earnings and vice versa. So for instance, because there's another question later on that asks, did you take money for yourself for, you know, buying a car or a TV or something, for your personal expenses? So I don't know if you would put that as an earnings variable or as a profit variable. On your point of these different numbers tell you something different on what the returns is on, that's something we haven't investigated so far. But it would be a good point. So it could be that the measurement error is more important when it comes to measuring return to physical capital as opposed to labor, things like that. Yeah.
Thanks. This is interesting. So just one comment on the numbers in the 2 different surveys. So I'm not sure if the QLFS that the earnings data you're using here is the one that's imputed. In the standard release, there's a lot of imputation. There's almost nobody with a missing or a refusal. I think in the panel version of the data, that is not there. But in the standard one that everyone can download from Statisé,
Right.
There's some imputation there, so you might need to worry about that. And then just, it seemed like there was a drop-off because you're in the number of observations, because I think some of the people in SESI don't report anything.
Right.
So then you're losing 400. So you might want to redo the first set, excluding those 400.
Yeah. Thank you.
Other questions? Anything else you'd like to say?
No? Good.
Oh, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Nick. Nick Buehren will be talking with us about Tanzania. Oh dear.
Hi, my name is Niklas Buehren. I work in the Gender Innovation Lab of the World Bank. And today I want to talk about a randomized controlled trial that we carried out in Tanzania. And it was sort of done on an intervention that tries to empower adolescent girls. I also want to mention that this is joint work. So this is together with my colleague Marcus Goldstein, as well as others, including Selim Goleski, Munshi Sulaiman, and Venus Yam. And so first, why should we care about empowering adolescent girls? Well, so there's just about 1 million people on the planet that are aged between 15 and 24 that reside in the developing world. And This situation is sort of particularly pronounced in sub-Saharan Africa, where more than 60% of the population is now aged below 25. And this situation is not going to go, or these statistics are not going to go any better or go away anytime soon, in particular because sort of the majority of the women have children and marry at much younger ages compared to their peers in the developed world. At the same time, they also face limited or even a lack of future labor market opportunities. And this can lead to a situation in which young girls decide to invest less into their human capital because they don't see the returns to it. But it can also lead them to have to be in marriages and to bear children at an earlier age. And there's also some evidence in the literature that is also might potentially increase sort of girls' reliance on older men. And then you have the opposite. You also do see that early motherhood and early marriage sort of can lead to lower human capital accumulation. And so what you end up with is sort of this vicious circle or equilibrium in which sort of low human capital investment, low labor force participation, as well as sort of women's limited control over their own bodies reinforce each other. And the key question for us then is, whether an intervention that tries to help adolescent girls to accumulate human capital, whether it can help break this cycle and whether it can help them move towards a better equilibrium. And so this is what we do in this study. We're investigating the effectiveness of an intervention that simultaneously tackles the economic challenges that these girls face by providing them with so-called livelihood skills training, as well as tackling sort of the social dimension or the social challenge that these girls face, and trying through what they call life skills training to help girls make better choices when it comes to reproduction and marriage. And I should also say that this is a replication. So both in terms of research as well as in terms of the intervention of an evaluation that we did earlier in Uganda. And I'm going to come back to the results from the Uganda study in a bit. But first, let me just briefly tell you what the ELA program is. It stands for the Empowerment and Livelihood for Adolescents program. It was developed and is being implemented in Tanzania by an NGO called BRAC. The original model was developed in Bangladesh, but then was sort of transported to the African context and is now rolled out in several countries in East and West Africa. And essentially the program builds on adolescent clubs. So you can think of these as youth clubs. These are safe spaces where the girls can go in the afternoons after school, sort of every day during the week, and there's a whole bunch of recreational activities. So the girls, they can stage drama, they can sing, they can read books, they're outdoor games. And girls in general actually, like this. So they go there, they hang out there, and BRAC makes use of that. And sort of while the girls hang out there, they tag on some training. And in particular, sort of along two dimensions. And so one is this livelihood training that I already mentioned, and focuses on sort of vocational skills as well as financial literacy skills. And then there is a life skill component, which teaches on various topics, including reproductive health, pregnancy, HIV knowledge, but also family planning, rape, women's empowerment, and so on. And so BRAC trains these girls, but then BRAC being a huge microfinance institution, they also offer these girls a microfinance opportunity. Which in general doesn't vary that much from their sort of standard microfinance approach, but in this case, it actually lowers a little bit the eligibility age to the sort of minimum level that's required in terms of age in Tanzania, and it's also a little bit more of a hands-on approach. So the groups are a little bit more, smaller, and they meet more often, sort of by specially trained microfinance credit officers. And BRAC has a very low touch when it comes to sort of enforcing which girls are targeted. There's sort of this age range of roughly 14 to 20 years that BRAC targets, but you know, girls are not going to be turned down if they're slightly younger or a little bit older than that. So this age is not very strictly enforced. And what we're building on is a randomized rollout of the ELA program. So BRAC identified around 150 communities where they thought they potentially could set up this intervention in the semi-urban areas around Dodoma and Iringa. And out of these 150 potential locations, we randomly selected 100 locations to receive an ELA club. And so this is our treatment group. The remaining 50 communities in which no club was open, that constitutes our control group. We took these 100 treatment communities and we randomly selected 50 of them to sort of have the core interventions of the ELA program, meaning the club as well as life and livelihood skills training. And 50 of these communities had that core, and 50 of them had also the microfinance component, which wasn't present in the other 50 clubs. Now, after we randomized, BRAC sort of opened and operated one club per locality. In terms of data, what we have available is from the original listing of adolescent girls that BRAC carried out in the potential survey sites. So they literally walk from house to house, sort of, you know, ask for the names of girls in the targeted age range. And typically by community, we get about 200 girls. We selected 40 of them randomly to participate in our baseline survey, and those are our study participants. And this baseline survey was conducted in 2009 before any club was open. And we interviewed at that time a little bit more than 5,400 respondents, and I'm not going to show it, but sort of the treatment and the control group are well balanced on sort of the observables that we measure. Now, after that, the clubs were established in 2009. The microfinance took a little bit longer and was introduced about 1 year later after the clubs opened and the 50 treatment villages where we had this component. The follow-up data was collected in 2011, meaning 2 years into the project, and unfortunately faced an extremely high attrition rate of 42%. Now, in this sort of, for this kind of target group, for this kind of age group, high attrition rates are not unusual. This one is very high. But we deal with it in various ways, and attrition does not seem to be correlated with treatment. I'm not going to go too much into this, and I'll tell you in a little bit why. But just to say that the participation rates of girls in the project was actually relatively comparable to the participation rates we find in Uganda. So if you focus on this table, if you sort of focus on row 3 here, that's our key measurement, whether these girls ever sort of chose to participate in the ELA club. I mean, if you remember, this is just a youth club. It's just set up. These girls don't have to go. They can go there. They can go as often as they want. They don't have to go for an entire afternoon. They can sort of come and go whenever they want. But we do get sort of a participation rate of nearly 20% there. In the clubs that also have the microfinance component. And so that's actually not that bad, and it's significantly different from the participation rate of those localities that had a club only and control communities. Now, there is a bit of participation in the control communities, which is natural in this kind of setting because some of the communities, the treatment communities, are very close to the control communities, and so if girls from the control communities, they can just walk over to a treatment community and participate there. And again, BRAC's not going to turn down a girl. They're sort of trying to stick to the research design, but if one girl really wants to participate, they're not going to turn her down. But we're not really too worried about that. And I'm also not going to make too much out of the participation indicator here. In the paper, we do have estimates that where we use it, but in here I just want to focus on the intention to treat estimates that we're showing. And this is sort of the most basic version of the estimations that we're using, and it's relatively standard. I think we have sort of interactions here for our two treatments. We have individual fixed effects. Later on, we'll difference it out and sort of estimate our treatment effects that way. We also try different specifications. I'm not going to show the results. And mainly I'm not going to show the results because there aren't that many. So when you look at income generating activities and you look at sort of the two treatment variables here separately, there seems to be very little impact of the program on these kind of dimensions and these kind of choices that the girl take. And this is a bit of a common theme, so we don't find any impacts on sort of financial market participation. There is a bit on the savings, and that actually becomes more interested when we pair this up with the kind of network information that we have. Again, I'm not going to focus on this too much in this presentation, and I'm gonna continue showing you zero results. So we also find very little when we sort of go into the more social outcomes and kind of attitudes that we measure. So we find very limited impact here. And so for us, this was obviously rather demotivating looking at this, and probably also the reason why the paper has been sitting around for a bit. But at the same time, quite frankly, from our perspective, these results are extremely interesting. And they're really interesting because we have our Uganda results as well. And just to briefly mention what the Uganda results are, so the research design is pretty much comparable. The sample is comparable. The intervention is exactly the same. The implementer is exactly the same. And if you had to do two impact evaluations in two different countries, picking Uganda and Tanzania, both being in Eastern Africa, it's perhaps not the worst choice you want to make. And so everything here is extremely similar. And in Uganda, we found these great impacts. I mean, in Uganda, this intervention was spectacularly successful. So we did find that self-employment activities increased by 93%. We find that spending on private consumption goods increased by 38%. Self-assessed entrepreneurial ability increased by 8%. We do even find impacts on the reported motherhood of these girls, which will go down by 28%. Being in a marriage or cohabitating with a partner decreases by 56%. We find sort of a knowledge, impact on knowledge. These girls know more about HIV, they know more about pregnancy. And we also do find, impacts on contraceptive use, in particular when it comes to always using a condom. We do find impacts on aspirations. These girls want to get married later. They do want to have fewer kids. So we find all these impacts, and we don't find them in Tanzania. And so for us, the way that we are approaching this now is very much, trying to figure out why it didn't work. And one large part of the story, to be honest, is just implementation challenges that were there in Tanzania. So already, having a guess that the implementation wasn't as successful as it was in Uganda, sort of very early on, there was some qualitative research that was done. in Tanzania by one person from BRAC. And sort of, there are a few stories that come out of that. So first, the project was originally meant to take place in Dar es Salaam, in sort of much more urban areas. BRAC went out, surveyed these girls in the communities, and they found that there's very little interest for this kind of intervention. So they regrouped, decided to go somewhere else, to Dodoma and Iringa, much more rural areas. But that really was a setback, was sort of a relaunch with constant resources. And so at that time, BRAC already burned through some of the implementation funding that was there, and sort of everything had to be done in a little bit of a lower touch. And at the same time, this is actually what you're supposed to do in a pilot, right? I mean, you sort of get early lessons, and you regroup and you try to do it better. One other sort of massive factor was that in Tanzania, the project relied on donated housing. So there was a project rationale to this. This was sort of the community's contribution. It was meant to get buy-in from the community to secure ownership of the community over the intervention. At the same time, that also caused that the project in Tanzania had sort of spaces that might have not been really ideal or adequate to what they were supposed to do, and there had to be a lot of adaptations and compromises had to be made that probably weren't the best. There were also other funding issues related to some input supplements that couldn't be given, and sort of weaker maintenance of club materials and fewer supervision missions. So the entire program was just a lot more light touch than in Uganda. And for us, this sort of speaks very much to something that perhaps, in sort of impact evaluations of interventions in these papers, of things that you don't really see described very well. If this program would have worked, we would have sort of written down the way in which the program operated the same way as in Uganda. And it's all true. The components are all the same. It's all true. Like the organizational structure, it's all the same. It's really all the same. But then there is sort of this unobservable, well, in our case, unobservable measure a little bit of implementation intensity. How much effort was there? How much enthusiasm was there? And, BRAC had a lot of challenges here, and, they just had to deal with it, and they had limited resources. So, these things can happen, but we do think it tells you sort of an important lesson also, when it comes to implementation, for evaluation, that, maybe one should do a little bit more work on sort of measuring, how much goes into monitoring and evaluation there. Okay, in conclusion, so we don't find any robust evidence of this program with several dimensions. Microfinance did a little bit in sort of attracting girls, but it didn't actually do much in terms of outcomes. We think this is largely due to sort of implementation challenges that the NGO faced, and for us, this is really the key message here is sort of, when you think about replication, when you think about scale up, there's always a risk of getting it wrong despite sort of the underlying model, the intervention by itself. There's nothing wrong with it. It can be very strong. It can still go wrong. Thanks.
Sorry, I forgot to upload but yeah. So I really enjoyed this paper, and I think it speaks to one of the major points of discussion these days, the way we do development economics, which is replicability. And the other thing it speaks to is, when we have these reduced form effects from evaluating a specific program, which comes as a package. Then when you find that it works in one place and in the other place, then you really wish that you knew, what exactly of this package is causing the difference. So I guess my first question is, do you have any evidence on this for the Uganda analysis? And then maybe that could help you explain why here it's not working, because from the current discussion you have, it seems that you present a list of possible explanations, and I wonder if the Ugandan paper can help you there, because in this particular case, the package effect may mask some components doing something, other components doing something else. You also, there are some, I guess, some technical issues. One is the analysis of the follow-up discussions you had. And at least in South Africa, we noticed that when we do this kind of follow-ups ex post and then we try to interpret what's happening, sometimes there is a risk of people trying to, let's call it positive response bias. And, you come here back because I participated into the program, you want to know more about things, and sometimes the responses are a little generic. For instance, the fact about resource constraints. I've been exposed to situations in which resource constraint is sort of one of the top explanations when something goes wrong, no matter what you're doing in whatever country. So I wonder if that is something that you didn't see in Uganda in the follow-ups, if you did do follow-ups in Uganda. And also, when you go on that discussion of girls learning and the sort of social learning mechanism, I wonder what the ordering of the question there was, because if you sort of tell me first that did you participate, did you talk to people, and then you ask me whether you talked about that. So I wonder if, again, going back to survey measurement issues, I wonder if that's something you are worried about. And the microcredit, I don't know, you didn't talk much in the presentation, but in the paper there's this interesting thing that it actually doesn't have an effect on credit, but savings, which is interesting, and I wonder if you have a story there, because you go there and talk about loans and people instead start saving. So that's just an interesting thing. I wonder if you have an explanation for that.
So I'll take the question now. Thanks a lot. And sort of, first of all, which relates to the third comment about savings versus credit, I should also say that the paper sort of we rewrote it in several ways, and I think you had an earlier version in which we put a lot more emphasis on the microcredit, and sort of we switched much more to the zero result now. So it's true. I left out quite a bit in terms of what we have in the analysis, and just to say that there, yes, it seems like the microcredit, it didn't do much for the credit, which is honestly not totally surprising, given that only 5% of the girls, as a matter of fact, took up the microfinance option. So they do come, they're sort of led more to the clubs, they participate more in the clubs, but by the microfinance opportunity, but they don't actually end up taking it. And honestly, some of that might also have to do with they hear about, okay, there's credit available, and then they learn about the terms of the credit, which might be less attractive to them that they possibly originally thought. But there is a saving story. So these girls start saving more, and sort of with the very limited network information that we have, it does seem that a lot of the savings, so remember these are intention to treat estimates, actually come from girls that are not participating. But through channels of talking about business and income generating activities. Now about the other two comments that were made. So the first one on the packaging, it's true. So this is a two-pronged, if you want, three-pronged approach. It's an intervention that offers a package, and for us this is also the main issue. I mean, for us this is clearly the biggest drawback that we have in our research design, is that we offer the bundle and we don't, we have no means of sort of unpackaging that. This is sort of part of a larger effort. So we're also evaluating this intervention in South Sudan and Sierra Leone. And in South Sudan is very much the same. Unfortunately, there we have, there was a conflict taking place during our evaluation period, and so we have to deal with that. And then in Sierra Leone, just after baseline, the Ebola broke out. So we have an additional challenge there, but in particular in Sierra Leone, we actually added treatment arms, and there we're trying to unbundle the package, and that's honestly for us that is the main thing that we want to do. So that's perfectly True. So the second comment was on, recall bias, and in particular, if you teach girls, certain skills, or they get a better sense of what they should answer, and then if you come back, they'll answer in your favor. And that is very much true. So you can question about a lot of these self-assessed measures. I think, so for example, when we see, when the girl tells us that she's more likely to use a condom, I think you should be cautious about this result because she learned about it. But at the same time, we also see movement on the reported motherhood, which I think is a much more objective measure. So, sort of taking these things together, that's sort of where we think we're more convinced. And then also in Uganda, we had other results where, for example, we asked them how content they are with their economic situation. They were more content after they and which goes together with, being more employed being more engaged in self-employment. But at the same time, they don't tell us that they feel any different about their family or so. So that's something that the program didn't attempt to move. And so taking these things together, that actually gives us a lot more confidence in the result.
Other questions?
I can see why you might not want to infer this, but given that you've carried out the same intervention in two different places and you've got two completely different results, why don't you just infer that nothing of any generality can ever be inferred from an RCT?
Could I ask a variation on Francis's question? Yep. You can decide which one you want to answer. Do you see variation in either the kinds of process measures that you described, the various things that went wrong, in both contexts, Uganda and Tanzania, or do you see variation in something not as kind of descriptive as the why did it go wrong, but simply take up, because you sort of showed the take up of you had different measures of take up, 30% on average, but surely that varied. So I wonder if in both Uganda and Tanzania you could exploit heterogeneity to get something where, on the surface of it, two things point in different directions completely.
Okay, so first, on the last thing that you said, we do see differences in take-up, and I don't think we've been as precise about this as we should have been up until now, and that's sort of also one area where we want to sort of do more and be more precise. We also see that there are slight differences in sort of the girls that actually do end up participating. So in Tanzania, for example, girls are much more likely to be enrolled in school. And unsurprisingly, then, they're also less interested in the livelihood skills, which arguably are driving our results in Uganda. So, from that side, it's a little bit a different set of girls that are participating. Participation is definitely lower, but at the same time, here I really wish we had better monitoring data, and I think we should have done more. But having been to these clubs in Uganda and in Tanzania, they are just very different places. And in Uganda, there was a lot more enthusiasm. You could feel it. It was just a lot more. Those are actually really, really happy places. Girls really like to hang out there. And in Tanzania, girls still participated. Girls just, still came to the clubs, but it wasn't sort of as much enthusiasm around it. And you could see it. I mean, you could really tell. And so, what you said, I don't see this as, I don't see this result for these two interventions. I don't see that as giving you the answer, and I don't think this should tell you, okay, RCTs, you can't replicate them. It doesn't, that you shouldn't trust them. I would honestly see this much more as, there are a lot of zero results out there that probably don't get published, and maybe there should be a little bit more work on why there are zero results. And I mean, honestly, in this case, the Tanzania results wouldn't be as interesting, or if you think, if we hadn't the Uganda results. And which is a bit of a luxury, to be honest.
Other questions, or do you want to follow up and then hand the mic?
Okay, can I come back on that? mean, what you're raising is the whole issue with RCTs. Unless you understand why individuals are responding as they are, then what your control and treatment to do is, it's causal, but we have no idea why. And you've just demonstrated how important that is by showing that you can take exactly the same intervention in a different country and get totally different results. So RCTs by themselves are almost completely useless.
It's not the kind of contribution we wanted to make, though. No, I think, I mean, honestly, I don't see it that way. And, like, it's honestly also a little bit related to the very first comment here, were we able to unpack this intervention and to see the channels through which the project worked. If you think, for example, it all works through the livelihoods components. Well, in Uganda, we weren't able to prove that. In Tanzania, we know that girls are much more likely to be in school, much more less likely to be interested in the livelihoods component. So, arguably, you shouldn't see these kind of impacts because there wasn't sort of as much of that specific mechanism. And I'm hypothesizing, I'm not saying this is true. But there was much less of this channel, of this mechanism. So the results that we could see could be because of that. However, knowing that we had these implementation challenges and that the resource constraints, I wouldn't bet my money on that. To me, this was starting out with sort of, the same model being implemented at a different scale, at a different intensity in two places, and that's sort of what drives these results.
If I understood correctly, you motivate, when you motivate this paper, you think about adolescent girls making these decisions, making these choices of, investing in human capital, of fertility, etc. The big missing piece here is the family, right? Because one can imagine that in many of these contexts, it's the family and social norms that dictate these choices. And so it's entirely possible that it's factors like take-up are influenced not by girls making these decisions, but by the family context. And did you ever look at that? Did you ever think about including that into the analysis?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, so we did not only interview the girls, so this is all from the interviews of the girls. At baseline, we also did interview parents, and sort of one, source for us was that to look at heterogeneity from the parental background, but to be honest, also to look at, the impacts on the girls. So in terms of, for example, attitudes, do these impacts actually translate to the families as well? So, does a mother hold different attitudes after her girl sort of becomes empowered through participation in the club? So we have these surveys. We've done some work in Uganda and sort of never got that far. It didn't seem to be sort of the main driver of heterogeneity in Uganda. And in Tanzania, we do have this at baseline, this information. So we could do more, but honestly, we just haven't gotten to it.
Maybe one more question over here.
Hi, did you see any difference in the kind of economic environments that the experiment took place in Uganda and Tanzania, like growth rates or urban-rural distinctions or something like that?
So early on, I honestly don't show it ever, but we did sort of some benchmarking exercises, in particular when it comes with the DHS survey, and we sort of tried to figure out who are actually the girls that we have in our sample and who are the girls that participate. We did a little bit of that, and it honestly, it wasn't, we never had the sense that we were dealing with sort of an exceptional, very exceptional group of girls. It seemed sort of all to be very much in line of what you would expect. When it comes to the cross-country comparison, honestly, I can say much less about that. We haven't tried to sort of look at whether these girls might have been on different trajectories or sort of, we haven't done that.
Niklas, thanks very much for your presentation. Our next presenter is Aya Suzuki.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Aya Suzuki from University of Tokyo, and this is joint work with Yuki Chimano of Hitotsubashi University and Gulma Bebe from Ethiopian Development Research Institute, who's sitting over there. Right. So our paper is really motivated by the presence of the growing labor-intensive export sector, such as agro-processing industry or horticulture or garment or light manufacturing industries. And these are really engine for the economic growth at the initial stage. And positive economic benefits at macro level is well known, such as creating employment opportunities or earning foreign exchange or positive spillovers of technical aspects. These are well documented, but the worker level impacts are not much known. Prominent effect you can think about is the higher wage for all sectors. So this industry come in and then the demand for labor goes up, so the wage for all sectors goes up. Really simple microeconomics. But on top of that, there's an additional effect found in studies called the exporter wage premium. So exporters are found to be paying a little bit higher wage than the ongoing market wage. And these are based on two theories. One is the standard competitive labor market model. It's just a standard micro supply and demand. It relates to workers' utility, and so the exporters are paying higher wage because the workers are actually of higher quality, or they're compensating for the bad or risky environment, compensating differential, or it could be because of the short-run immobility of labor. On the other hand, there's an efficiency wage theory developed by Stiglitz and others. It relates to firms' heterogeneous ability to bear different kinds of costs. It could be union threats, or it could be that monitoring labor is costly, or it could be they want to reduce turnover rates. And these are discussed, but these discussions are big in the trade literature, so most use firm-level data. They're not using the worker level. So they're not controlling for selection bias and still lacking evidence from the developing countries. So we take a case of the cut flower industry in Ethiopia, which is a really newly emerging industry. I think started in the early 2000s with a big government support. So specifically, we're testing 5 hypotheses. The first one, a greater presence of the cut flower sector within the locality contributes to raise wages. So higher wage due to more demand for labor, as I mentioned before, it's affecting for all the sectors in the locality. Second hypothesis, cut flower sector is offering wage premium to its workers compared to similar workers in the other sectors in the same locality. So this is the exporter wage premium. So we think there's a wage premium in this sector as well. And thirdly, this wage premium, the size of this wage premium is affected by the importance of the sector within the locality. So this wage premium could be higher or lower depending on the importance of that sector in the locality. We cannot really sign whether it's going to be positive or negative beforehand because it could be that more demand for the specific cut flower labor, more demand for labor, so leading to higher premium. But it could be that because the sector is more important, there are more labor specifically in the cut flower sector, so replacement cost of a worker is less, and that may lead to lower premium, so we don't know. And then the final fourth and fifth hypothesis are pretty much based on our anecdotal evidence from the field. So working in this modern stable sector, cut flower industry workers tend to save more than their counterparts, and they are more satisfied with their jobs, particularly in terms of stability. So we'll be testing these specific hypotheses. So some pictures. This is a view from above. So you see suddenly this like really gigantic structure like this. And these are greenhouses. And inside this is, these are production workers transporting flowers. This is inside the packaging house. They work in a team like this. They do sorting, grading, and packaging here. Right. And yeah, they work every day from 8 to 4. They commute together, they eat together, and they go home together. So it's very high social interaction in this industry. And this is a typical structure of a cut flower farm. So at the bottom of the pyramid, there's a production workers here. They do planting, weeding, harvesting, transporting, grading, packaging, etc. Easy job, but as I said, they need teamwork, and they are supervised. They are constantly monitored by supervisors, and above them, they are farm manager, administration, and general manager. But we focus on these guys. Right, the data, so we collected our own data at the worker level, and we also have farm census surveys over years. We use some of that. But in the worker survey, we have 3 groups. One is the production workers, in the cut flower sector. They're stratified random sampling. And comparison group is a group of workers who have similar attributes, but not in the cut flower sector. And then we also have data on the supervisors, but in this paper, we're not using this one. And then for the comparison group, it was difficult to get the comparison group because there's no list of workers whose potential to be employed in the cut flower sector is the same as these guys. So, and then picking people randomly from the locality will not be good because you may end up picking up a medical doctor whose potential of being employed is very different. So we relied on the production workers network, and we asked them to name people who are who are not in the sector but who have a similar attributes in terms of education, age, and gender. And admittedly, it's not a random sampling, but we'll deal with this in the estimation. So these guys have similar attributes, but not in the cut flower sector. And typical jobs that they're engaged in are like housemaid, beauty salon worker, waiter, laundry worker, etc. And then we also had unemployed and students in our sample, but we decided to omit these people because a lot of variables of our interest relates to income, and including them will probably overestimate our results, so we decided to omit them. Right. So this is descriptive statistics. So these workers tend to be in their late 20s. And a lot of them are female, 80% female, education level like 6 years. Some characteristics are different between 2 groups, but we control for this in the estimation. This is distribution of monthly income. This is for the cut flower worker, and then this comparison. On average, they have a similar income level, but the distribution is different because cut flower sector is just one sector, but comparison group, as you see, it's different sectors. Right, and another variable is the job satisfaction level. So we asked in terms of 5 aspects, how satisfied are you in the scale of 1 to 5? And production worker is this red line. Seems like they have a bigger pentagon than the comparison group. Right, and then the variable to represent the importance of the cut flower sector in the locality, so we created this variable, cut flower density. We defined it as the number of cut flower workers in the Wareda, which is the small sub-district, over the total working population in the Wareda. And these are the cut flower farms. Right, and then this is the estimation method. So why we have income and saving and job satisfaction levels, and we have cut flower density representing the importance of the cut flower sector in the area, and cut flower dummy 1 or 0. If you're in the cut flower sector, it's 1, and we have that interaction term. So we want to see whether these coefficients are significant. So the issue is, selection bias of workers and farms. So we deal with it with several strategies. We do propensity score matching and also inverse propensity score weighting regressions. We use weights developed by Hirano and Imbens, and then we also trimmed our sample. And to deal with the farm selection bias, we use IV. We use the altitude of that varieta as an IV. So the idea is that the altitude affects where the farm will be located, but it will not affect the wage or saving rate or satisfaction. Right, so these are the results. Right, so this is income and wage we have, and this is the worker level variable, worker level variable. So the cut flower density is positive and significant. So if the cut flower is important in that locality, the wage is actually higher than in other area. So it's positive all the way. So it confirms the first hypothesis. Secondly, this is worker level dummy, cut flower dummy. This is positive and statistically significant. So if you're in the cut flower sector, your income or wage, which is controlled by the number of hours worked, is higher than their counterparts in other sectors. And thirdly, this is the interaction term. So we wanted to see whether this cut flower premium is affected by the importance of that sector in the area. And these are also significant. We find it negative. So it seems that if the cut flower farm is more important in the area, the wage premium is actually lower. So these are our hypotheses 1, 2, 3. And for the saving behavior, so we looked at whether you save or not. And then this is a saving rate, is the amount of saving over amount of income. So the proportion of the income that you save. And they are both positive and statistically significant. So it seems that production workers in the cut flower sector, they save more. Right, and this is a job satisfaction level. It's a 5 aspects, and then this is a total. Again, we find it is positive and significant. In total, yeah, it is significant. Particularly stability, they're happy about the stability, but it's interesting that they're not really happy about the type of work that they do. Yeah. And then we also looked at the heterogeneous effects on financial performance and job satisfaction level. So these are the coefficients on the interaction term between the cut flower and all these things. So for income, age is rewarded in this sector, but education is not, at least at this level of unskilled workers. Job satisfaction level, interestingly, years worked is negative, so their satisfaction level about the job, it goes down quickly with years worked for the cut flower workers compared to others. And risk-averse people, they are more happy about having a job in the cut flower sector. Right, so why higher wage, right? So we think that it is an efficiency wage to reduce turnover rates, because we've been conducting surveys for the cut flower farms over years, and high turnover rate is a big concern for the general manager. Training is costly for the farms, although the tasks that the production workers engaged in are pretty simple, but to be adept at these tasks takes time and experience. It takes away also the supervisor's time. And as I mentioned, it's a team-based task, so loss of one worker doesn't mean that you just have one less worker, but the whole team's productivity will go down. This was a study of the same industry in Kenya. He's mentioning about the productivity, team's productivity here. And we also found that actually the wage premium is lower where there is more supply of workers, so probably because the replacement cost of the worker is less. Okay. Right. Why save more? We think it's because of this high social interaction in this sector. Maybe working through the ROSCA, ICUB, high trust, easy monitoring and screening, because they work together every day. It may be working as a good reminder to save, because they say they have same payday in cash. And also maybe it's even imposing pressure to save, because they are mostly mothers. They want to be good mothers. So it could be, these could be the reasons for that results. So for the conclusion, just repeating what I said, but emerging labor-intensive export cut flower sector has positive impacts on wage for all sectors, and cut flower sector additionally offering a wage premium, probably reduced to turnovers. And this size of premium is affected by the importance of the sector. Cut flower workers save more relative to their counterparts, and also they are happier about stability, but not the type of work, and their satisfaction level about the job decreases faster with the years of work than in other sectors. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.
I just realized that I actually didn't put up the one slide I had, but that's okay. I think I also get it together. So at first I got to say, like I have a lot of research focus on Ethiopia. So for me, this was really interesting to read. I quite like the paper. I also find the results that they find are very interesting. I think it's to me this was just a lot to learn, and in many ways, and to some extent that didn't get highlighted enough, is like this is like done on a very small sample of less than 300 people that were observed, and sort of there were very interesting aspects to the kind of information that they elicited and the way that they did it. In particular, I thought, the sort of rigorousness, how they tried to elicit risk preferences and experimental ways, sort of how to assess a willingness to compete as a personal individual characteristic. I thought all that was extremely interesting. However, so for me, interpretation of the results and looking at these results, I just can't, sort of keep myself from coming back to the fact that this is ex post data. So these are already realized outcomes. The sampling frame is based on going to workers and sort of through referrals to their friends and trying to find a comparison group. And so there is this table that was shown in the presentation where you see that these two groups, the treatment, the control group here, sort of vary along certain dimensions, and it's just very, you just keep on wondering whether this is sort of, due to sort of, true impact from these jobs, whether this is due to the referral process, or whether this is just because it's a very small sample and you sort of get a bias in there that way. And so, throughout sort of interpreting these results, like I kept on coming back to this question. And I think one aspect that, at least for me and others might feel more comfortable with this, is sort of that doesn't help is a propensity score matching, which is a bit of a black box, especially taken together with sort of the way that the sample is constructed, having this referral process. And so at times I think I would have actually preferred to sort of go back to more, vanilla style, 2 or less regressions, just sort of controlling for some of the key variables, especially those variables where you see differences, but sort of that are more arguably exogenous, and just to make sure and to convince the reader that these are very robust, and sort of the building up the results from the very bottom and sort of adding complications at a time, instead of sort of starting with the propensity score matching technique. But I do realize that this is difficult sometimes in these kind of working with these kind of samples, and I think that, you know, the way that you work with it and the kind of analysis that's done and the kind of interpretation that the results get, like that's still very interesting. I really liked it. So thanks.
You want to answer any of these questions before we go to that?
Yes. Okay, thank you very much, Nick. Yes, so, yeah, we only have ex post data, and this is, as you mentioned, well, comparison group was really difficult to obtain, so we just, we relied on the referral process, as you mentioned, so that is really the limitation of our data. But I didn't show it today, but we also asked about the income and saving before you started this job, and there was no significant difference between the two groups. So yeah, that could be one evidence that, you know, it could be the impact from the sector. But yeah, we did the PSM and PSM results and plus the inverse propensity score regressions. So in the regressions, we are controlling for all these variables. Yeah, maybe if we can do some more RCT, you know, assign this industry randomly, then we can have a pure estimates. But I think in reality it was difficult. So yeah, we just try to do whatever we can do. So, but thank you very much for your comments.
Other questions? There's a question here in the middle.
I really like the paper, but I have a little bit of concern on the kind of efficiency wage things. Because if you think that efficiency wage, then, for example, if you include like the factory workers or other things, then they may also face some same efficiency wage constraints. So kind of an implicit assumption is that cut flower industry have like the unobserved effort is much more important, or monitoring the effort is much more costly than the other industries. So that's kind of implicit assumptions. So you gotta elaborate on that things. And then if you look at the results, like the interaction time of the cut flower density times cut flower is negative, seems a little bit odd to me, because if it is efficiency wage to prevent turnover, then if there are so many cut flower industries around me, then I have many chance to go to other cut flower industries. So in that case, then it is not quite clear if the wage premium should be decreased if there are so many cut flower industries in the same regions. So kind of more kind of work on that gonna be required.
Can you repeat the second one? Yeah, if
you try to interpret the results of the negative coefficient of the interactional times cut flower times cut flower density, then I'm afraid that it doesn't fit to the theory of the efficiency wage, or if you add some extra assumptions.
Okay. Well, yeah, we're interpreting the negative coefficients so that if the sector is important in that area, then there's more supply of labor specifically for the cut flower sector. So even you lose one person, you can hire that like experienced person right away. So the replacement cost is lower. So yeah, so it could be the reason that you know the premium is actually paid to reduce turnover. That's our thinking. Okay. Yes. Thank you.
Other questions? Over here.
So the discussant mentioned there were 250 observations. If half of those are from cut flowers, I don't know what the exact number is, that's 125. So I'm just wondering how many households you needed to sample to get 125 cut flower people, and just thinking about what we can learn if we have a relatively small budget and how do we sample people. I'm guessing that was really difficult. You had to sample a huge number of households to get 125. And then, so I guess the alternative, which has been done by CSAE, I know maybe others, is to sample the people at the firms.
Yes, yes, that's what we did.
You did?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So you said something about a randomized stratified
Yeah,
sample. So that's from the population census that was up in your slides. So,
yeah.
Okay, then I got that wrong. Right.
Yeah, sorry, it wasn't clear. But we have, because we've been conducting a farm census, so we have a list of farms, cut flower farms. So, but we didn't interview all of them. So we stratified the cut flower farms into several strata based on the geographical data. And then from there, we picked I don't remember, 5 flower farms. And then from each flower farm, we picked 10 to 15 workers. So, yeah, sorry about that.
Other questions?
So how many workers work in this cut flower industry?
In total, I don't have the number top of my head, but well, the average number of workers in the cut flower sector is 500 per farm. So it's really, how many farms? Now I think active 80. Yes, yes. So it's quite huge industry. Yes. Yes.
Direct employment in the flower industry, it would be around 55 to 60,000, but there are indirect employment as well related with distribution, transportation, and so on. So the number would be a bit higher than what's officially reported, but the official report is about 55K.
My comment is that's a pretty small sector. So, if you're interested in this sort of general question of what's driving employment, then you want to know what are the constraints on expanding this sector. Are they to do with the agronomic conditions that you need to expand, or are they to do with the inefficiency with which these firms are operating?
Sorry, I couldn't really hear the question.
So, given that you're talking about 40 to 50,000 people, you're talking about a very small sector, and I'm wondering what constrains its expansion. Is it agronomic, i.e. there's just a limited number of places where you can establish a farm, or is it to do with the operation of the farms itself, that they are so inefficient that they're unprofitable and nobody wants it to expand them?
So the question is why, what's the constraint to expand the sector? Okay. I think the initial costs were very high. As I showed, the structure is very big. It's very capital intensive. You need labor too, but then in the beginning you have to have a big structure, and you need to have, it's 100% exported, so it has to be in certain area near the airport. Yeah, it's a lot of initial investment is quite high. So, and then he has some. Yeah, he can. Yeah.
So that's correct. In addition to the sort of initial investment, most of the sector is initially concentrated around Addis Ababa and its surrounding area. And land in that part of the country has been growing in terms of price. Now it's becoming quite expensive. And most of the new investments that want to invest in this sector want to invest in that particular area. But land is quite expensive, and you won't be able to actually make any profit if you yourself procure land and invest. Initially, people who got into the sector got the land from the government relatively at a cheap, very cheap lease prices, but that's no longer there. And investors are increasingly being encouraged to move outside of that particular corridor, move to areas that are relatively remote. But flower industry is not like manufacturing sector or other sectors. Transport link is extremely important because almost nothing is sold locally, everything is exported. So it needs to be located close to the airport, it needs to be refrigerated, and cold chain facilities are important. In the absence of that, the sector cannot expand. Just to put this in perspective, in the early 2000s, export from Ethiopia was almost zero. It started growing, now it's about $246 million. So it's massive growth in the last couple of 10 years. Ethiopia is now the second largest exporter of flour next to Kenya in Africa. And this only in a span of 10 to 15 years. But as you said, it appears to be leveling off prematurely. But we expect to have a second phase of expansion because of increasing land availability, cold chain facility, transport infrastructure, and including airports as well.
I think we should close it there. Thanks again to our presenter and to discuss it. Again, I'm Owen Ozier. I'm the last presenter now. Today I'm going to be talking about a project in Kenya. It's called A Firm of One's Own. I'm talking about the shorter and longer term impacts of an intervention for young women in Kenya. This is joint work with Andrew Brudevold, who's a graduate student at the University of Maryland, Pam Jakila, who's here, who's also at the University of Maryland, Maddalena Onorati, who's in the World Bank, and with myself. The motivation here is pretty similar to the motivation you've heard from some of the earlier presentations, so I won't repeat it too much. But the point here is that in sub-Saharan Africa, and in Kenya in particular, the population of youth, and you can measure that a variety of ways, let's say those under 25 years old, is growing, and it's growing more rapidly than the formal sector is growing in order to absorb this expanding population. As a consequence, a lot of these young people won't actually be able to find employment in the formal sector in the short term, and the question is what to do. So there are a variety of approaches that people have taken, but the evidence on some of these programs, entrepreneurship, that is to say stimulating entrepreneurship via microfinance, via vocational training, is mixed. And when we think about why that evidence might be mixed and why a program might work or not, we have to reflect on, the model. What are some of the underlying constraints that any of these programs might relax? Are they human capital constraints? Are they credit constraints? Are they both? Are there other things? And in any event, in this field, in this area, the evidence on what works is relatively scarce. We do have some very promising findings, and some of the promising findings in the literature are about bundled programs. These are programs that seem to recognize the likely complementarities between different arms of an intervention. So if you combine business or life skills training with relaxation of the credit constraint, or if you combine a business training with a life skills training, if you put more elements into a program, although it may be difficult to disentangle, these programs that exploit these complementarities seem to have greater success. Whether or not they can be replicated, as you've seen in Niklas's presentation, is another question. But we've got this sort of hopeful evidence here from both Uganda and Liberia. And these are not the only papers. A meta-analysis by our co-author and Junyoung Cho showed that actually it was the bundled programs that combined both training and some element of financing, some element of relaxing a credit constraint. It was those that across the board had outperformed either component alone. So with that in mind, we said, let's evaluate such a program. Let's try and see if that's the map, if that's the model, can we make it work in another context? So what I'm going to talk about today is the Girls Empowered by Microfranchise program, which is implemented by the International Rescue Committee and a couple of community-based organizations in Nairobi. And the idea of microfranchising is to relax these constraints, to overcome the barriers that might face young women wishing to be entrepreneurs. So it's going to do the following. It's going to connect unemployed participants with well-established business models, and then it's going to help them launch small-scale multi-person franchises. So this means they don't have to come up with a business model, okay? That might be one of the barriers to becoming an entrepreneur. You have to think of what business it is that you'd like to start. This program is going to come to you as a participant with a couple of business models in mind, and you just have to take one off the shelf. This program is going to give you key elements of self-employment. So you're going to be able to set your own hours, you're going to be able to add and remove products as you see fit, you can expand, you can contract, you can shut down, you can restart. So it's very flexible, which you might think is one of the benefits of self-employment, despite having this off-the-shelf business model. You don't have to develop your own plan. The capital, so maybe there's a capital constraint or a credit constraint, the capital is given to these young women to start these businesses. So we're going to relax the business plan constraint, we're going to relax the credit constraint, and there's going to be training of several different varieties. So if the state of the human capital or of the skills in this labor market is not sufficient to achieve entrepreneurship, that's going to be tried to be rectified in this program as well. So you're thinking of all the barriers that might stop people from starting businesses, and we're going to try and address them all in this program. And it's going to be a randomized controlled trial. We're going to compare the participants in this program to others who also applied, but because the program was oversubscribed, did not actually participate. So you've got treatment and comparison. Now, these elaborate bundled programs aren't the only thing that has been shown to be hopeful recently, that has shown successes. There's a lot of buzz right now around cash grants. And there's a question of whether cash grants can stimulate entrepreneurship. Now, I want to point out that when I'm talking about a cash grant, I'm not talking about an unconditional cash transfer that's made repeatedly as part of a social safety net. Okay, that's a part of safety nets in a lot of countries. This is not that. This is a one-shot deal, one lump of cash. Okay? And when we look at other programs that evaluate things like or exactly one lump of cash, there are a couple of exciting studies out there, that of Chris Blattman and co-authors, and that of Johannes Haushofer and Jeremy Shapiro, showing that grants improved incomes, increased farm and enterprise revenues. In some cases, there are these mixed findings where they decrease profits and they show unclear impacts in sort of rural versus urban areas. But there is some promise to these cash grants. When you make cash grants to female micro-entrepreneurs, and I want to remind you, this is a project for young women in Nairobi slums, there's repeated evidence in a variety of contexts that while a cash grant to a male entrepreneur who already has a business may increase profits, it generally doesn't do that for female entrepreneurs. So would this work for these young women? And there's a variety of studies here. When you do cash grants for people who don't have their own businesses, it is for likely entrepreneurs that these cash grants seem to be more effective. A couple of studies here. One caveat to a number of these studies, not all, but some, is that many of the follow-ups are a short time after the intervention. 6 months in the case of Liberia, 4 and a little more months in most of the data in the Give Directly study in Kenya, 6 months in the case of the cash prizes in these 3 countries, Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Zambia. So if I give you several $100s and I ask you the next day, how much money do you have? Certainly you'll have several $100s more than you would have otherwise. How long does it take for that to convert into a success or failure? I think that's an open question. And so we're going to try and get at that in this study a little bit. An important thought experiment here is, besides burning down the cash, if there is a credit constraint that is part of a poverty trap, okay, then giving you the cash at the beginning, relieving that credit constraint, should allow you to exit the poverty trap. And so any impact that you see for a short time, you should also be able to observe an impact for a longer time. If it's not part of a poverty trap, or if there was no credit constraint whatsoever, you might see no impact in the long term, and you might not even see an impact in the short term. So I want you to reflect on that as we go through our results. So this study is going to try and do a couple of things. This is a picture of one of the neighborhoods. This is going to randomize whether you, once you apply to the IRC's microfranchising program, whether you get the microfranchising program itself, as I've described it, whether you get a cash grant, or whether you are in the comparison group. So there's 3 arms here. The comparison group is not going to get anything at all. The cash grant is going to be roughly equivalent to the value of the program, and then there's the program. Those are going to be the 3 things we're going to do. We're also going to do more than one follow-up. I'm going to show you 3 different points in time in this presentation if I don't run out of time, which I might. So here's how this goes. I told you a bit about the intervention. I told you it's a bundled program. There's a collection of features to it. I want to point out that the age here, this is for youth, but these are 18 and 19-year-olds. So when we talk about youth, some people say that's anybody under the age of 35. These are really youth, along the lines of the program that Niklas was talking about. They're 18 or 19 years old. So they're sort of making the transition to adulthood. I think I've talked about most of the things on this slide. To give you an idea, posters were put up all around these neighborhoods. We recruited people. This is how we got all these applications that were then randomized. If you went into the micro-franchising program, there were two business models that you were going to end up in. Either you were going to start a hair salon, which involved months, actually, of intensive training at an academy run by a company that makes products that are used in a hair salon. Or you were going to get a cart to sell smoked chicken sausages from, and you could add other products. You can see this young woman selling eggs that she's boiling alongside the chicken sausages. And for that, the training is basically a single day. On top of, I'm going to scroll back a couple of slides, on top of the training for these models specifically, there's also a general business and life skills training that IRC organized that goes with all of this. So no matter which business model you end up in, you get one of these business and life skills training thing that lasts a little more than a week. And on top of that, in case persistence or troubleshooting the business was any kind of a problem, there's ongoing mentoring by other young women, slightly older young women, after the micro-franchises are launched. So the IRC and its compatriot community-based organizations were really trying to relieve all the possible constraints. Going forward again, the cash grant is pretty simple, and again, the thought experiment here is it's going to relax only the credit constraint. So if it's only the credit constraint that is holding young women back from sort of having a higher income stream and a better livelihood in these slums, this should do it. And so that's the extent to which we're going to be able to unbundle the many things going on here. A nice thing, of course, about cash grants is that whatever their impacts, they're very low cost to administer, whereas the other program was quite complicated both to construct and to run. So a few things. We're going to show you 2 to 6 month impacts, 6 to 9 month impacts, and 12 to 18 month impacts. This is going to be, the first one's going to be from a very short phone survey, so there are only going to be a few things I'm going to be able to say, and then these are from much more detailed surveys. Again, this is in Kenya. We're going to zoom in on Nairobi. These little blue specks around Nairobi are the areas in which the program took place. So it's within Nairobi, but it's on the periphery. It's not Kibera, but these are other slums, Babadogo, Dandora, and Lunga Lunga. Again, we randomized about 1,000 applicants to 3 different arms. It's reasonably balanced. We could talk about that. I'm going to skip through the timeline. I want to show you a few things about this. We worked really, really hard to find almost everybody. 98%, 94%, 93%. This is balanced across treatment arms. And even a couple of months after we started, 30% of the women, we asked for 2 or 3 phone numbers from everybody. 30% of the people we found here were not using any of the phone numbers that they'd given us at baseline at all. So we used those phone numbers to then find the people who knew their phone numbers so that we could now find their phone numbers again. So we had to repeat this process over and over, and doing this midline actually allowed us to track the people later on. And we gave small top-ups if you would send us your number if you ever changed your number. So we did stuff like that, and it worked pretty well. I could talk a bit about the sample, but the key thing is half of them were living with a parent at baseline. This is about their schooling and stuff. These are people who are making the transition to adulthood. Important, everybody who we offered a grant to took it, but only about 60% of people who we offered the micro-franchising program to took it. They all said they were interested. They all filled out an application form. They all came to a baseline survey, and then we called them and said, will you come to this? This actually turns out to be very typical for programs like this. Young adults have a lot of different things going and are exploring different opportunities. So 60% is a pretty typical compliance rate. But when we think about the analysis, I'll mention that again. I'm going to skip through some of this. This is how they use the cash grants. So I'm going to show you intention to treat estimates. That's all that I'm really saying here. And what this means is the impact, the coefficient on the micro-franchising is the ITT. If you want to know the effects of the treatment on the treated, those who actually took the program, you'd have to think of our treatment as an instrument for the program, and you'd scale up this coefficient by about another 60%. So very quickly, after a couple of months, we see a big jump in income generating activity hours, a big jump in self-employment hours. We don't see substitution away from paid work for somebody else. So it seems like both the franchise treatment and the cash grant treatment are doing something positive for these young women. They're working more, they're working unpaid less. And that's about all I can say about that. When we come to the 6 to 9 month, we no longer see any increase from these programs in doing participation in the labor force, but we see this 10% shift, and this is big. This is in relation to the baseline, the control mean of 24%. There's a lot of people doing self-employment who wouldn't be doing it otherwise. And you really can't distinguish these coefficients at all. The cash grant, which relieves only the credit constraint, is doing almost the exact same thing by this simple measure, the mean, as the elaborate microfranchising program. We see a few other things. For example, people shift out of distasteful sectors during this time. And I'm going to skip through a little bit here, the distribution of hours worked. In the grant treatment, we see that it's not, this is a CDF difference, it's not just that they're doing a little bit of work. This is a lot of people who are working at least 40 hours a week. These are graphs about the probability of working at least some number of hours per week. So people are doing a lot of work as a consequence of getting these grants. Self-employment hours, a lot of this is driven by self-employment. And then exciting thing is after 6 to 9 months, we see impacts on income, no matter how you measure it. You can measure it in the log, you can measure it in the level, you can see that it's driven by self-employment income, but there is this increase in income in the short term, and it's pretty substantial. So we're talking about a 60 or 70% increase in self-employment income that in turn is a 50% increase in income overall. As I'm basically out of time, I'll say that the distributional effects are slightly different, and I'll say that in the longer run, and this is the important thing, we still see that there's this increase in self-employment activity, but we know, and at this point, only the franchise treatment shows an impact in labor market participation overall. When we ask about income, we don't see anything on average. There's still an increase in income from self-employment a year and a half later, but that's offset by a slight decrease, though not statistically significant, in money from working for someone else. I'm going to scroll back one slide to point out that there is this 10% significant and 5% significant effect on the likelihood of earning at least a little bit of money. So both of these programs might do something there, but you have to wonder about multiple testing corrections here as well. So the one interesting thing, the long-lasting effects, we see the involvement in any income-generating activity in the franchise treatment only. We see a persistent effect in self-employment, and this is maybe the last and most interesting point, a persistent effect on the likelihood of employing others. These are not just own account workers, which is what a lot of self-employment is in sub-Saharan Africa. There's a 3 to 5, factor of 3 to 5 increase on the likelihood that you employ others. But in the comparison group, that's 1 percentage point. So a factor of 3 means you're now 3% likely to employ someone else. But that's a substantial effect in relation to this population, in relation to self-employment in sub-Saharan Africa generally. So when we think about this, we have to think the cost effectiveness should be calculated not only from short-term impacts, but also long-term. And we're working now with the IRC to calculate some of those. And we have to wonder, why is it that people stay in self-employment? Is it because there are non-pecuniary elements to self-employment that improve their welfare, even if not through income? Or is it that your choice of occupation is sticky and that staying in self-employment is actually a mistake? So we hope that methodologically, this idea of comparing cash grants to much more elaborate programs allows you to generate a cost effectiveness benchmark in any context, and that the notion of following things up for the longer term allows cost effectiveness to be measured more carefully for everybody. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Owen. So yeah, I'll discuss this paper, and this paper is really exciting to read. You know, the interventions are very practical, like hair salon workers and mobile cart. I think really meaningful, and and it's also evaluating the long-term impact, which is important as kind of, income-generating activities. And the finding that the cash transfer is actually, the effect is no different from other franchising treatment was also interesting. And also there was a spillover for the people who are treated will employ other people. That's like even positive, more results. So I think it was interesting. But several comments, motivation of the study. So I think in the presentation, Owen was more specific about the franchising and what constraints it's removing. But I wanted to understand the economic significance of focusing on franchising, because there's now a lot of literature on the evaluating the impact of training, like managerial training, technical training. But I think this paper is unique in that it's offering a franchising treatment. So I think you want to stress what is the economic significance of focusing on that. So like less risk in marketing or procuring input is easy, or acquiring skills. So I think you want to mention more about that. And like the previous presentation, it's a bundled intervention, so it's kind of difficult to understand like what is affecting what. So I guess if your focus was franchising, maybe franchising and regular technical training was, maybe easier to interpret the significance of franchising. Second comment, it's a franchise intervention. And then you had two different work, a hair salon and a mobile cart franchising. But the intervention was very different, as you mentioned, like hair salon, 8 weeks of training and 2 weeks of intern, plus startup kits. But for the mobile cart, it was just 1 day training, on top of that, the business training that they were having. So I think the intervention is very different. So maybe you can differentiate the impact, because hair salon training seems like more about acquiring skills, while mobile cart training was more about having connections to the brand. So maybe if you separate out, maybe you can see more what's happening. And because it's a franchise, I was kind of concerned about this market stealing effects. And the project was implemented in I think a small place, right? So for franchising, any kind of franchising, locational consideration is very important. You don't want to compete with each other, but you are, given this mobile cart or hair salon work in a small place, so maybe there's a competition among the participants, and that may be the reason that you have negative. You don't see the income effect that much in the area. So I think you want to think about that too. And lastly, estimation methods. It's focused on ITT. Yeah, that's good, but I think compliance rate is very different between the franchise treatment and cash transfer. Cash transfer, almost everyone took it, but franchise treatment, the take-up was really low. So I think it's difficult to see whether the impact difference is because of the intervention or because of the low take-up rates for the franchise. So maybe you can also show TOT or late using random assignment as an IB. And I think you have panel data, but I wasn't sure whether the estimation was using the panel nature or just a cross section. And also in the paper it was mentioned that there's a multiple group in the training. So in the hair salon treatment, the people are categorized into several groups and they work together. So I thought maybe there's some room for self-selection into groups, or I wasn't sure whether they have to work together in the same salon, or so some more explanation would be appreciated. Minor comments. I saw some overlaps between the baseline and then the starting up the intervention, like 1 month. So I was just concerned about that. And two last things is that, because it's income generating activity, so like the impact on the performance, such as sales and profits, may be interesting. And also examining who did not continue participating or who started business but dropped out would also be interesting. Thank you.
So let me answer a couple of those quickly. First on the treatment on the treated versus the local average versus the ITT. So if your goal is to reach a population, then this population applies and says we would like to participate. The coefficients I've showed are the ones that are the average effect on those populations. If you could figure out in advance who the people were who would comply, then that would be an interesting object. But then you would have sort of changed the population about which this is a program. And so I think it's an interesting choice, and I think it's worth showing the other coefficients. Quickly, the baseline and intervention timing, you're right, there's some overlap, but the way it works is we did it in stages. So we'd get 300 or 400 applications and take everybody's fingerprints and randomize those. And then 300 or 400 more baseline, fingerprinted, randomized, and so on like that. So there's nobody who did baseline after starting the intervention. But it is the case that some people had started the intervention while others in other parts of town were just getting baselined. So that's true. And I could talk a little more about some of the other points. We were a little bit concerned, so quickly on the comparison to traditional vocational training, we designed our cash grant to be identical in size to, it's $250, it was at the time 20,000 Kenya shillings. That's identical in size to a cash grant given out by some other researchers, Isaac and Beatty, Ted Miguel, Joan Hamery Hicks, and co-authors, also in Kenya. Although their sample is slightly different, we intentionally did that so that we can see whether, on the basis of the population differences, the exact same magnitude cash grant works differently. And their study also includes pure vocational training. So by extension, we should be able to make a comparison across all of these. We couldn't get all the arms in one study, but we saw that their study was rolling out, so we coordinated with them to make it as comparable as possible. So in a year or two, we should be able to see how those things measure up. And we are interested in disaggregating by franchise model, because one of the things we did at application time is to ask, which type of franchise would you like to do if you are afforded the opportunity to join this program, so before randomization. So we know for the treatment and for the comparison group whether they would have liked to be selling chicken sausages or in a hair salon. So we haven't disaggregated the effects yet, but that's on the agenda too. So thanks for your comments, and we can talk more later. There's a question.
So two questions. First off, I'm interested how you measured your income variables. So was this business profit? Is this profit for the business, or is this profit across all their businesses? So I think over time, people tend to distribute risk by doing multiple businesses, so I want to make sure you're capturing
all businesses.
That. So all businesses?
All businesses.
Okay, great.
Most people have only one, but there is a fraction that has two or three, and we've captured all. That's what my co-author was going to say.
And my other question is, so you have data on the control group over time. So does the effect disappear because the control group is, all of them are engaged in IGAs, or is this?
It's true that from 6 to 9 months to the 12 to 18 months, the control group increases in the likelihood of having an income generating activity, and it increases in its total income. So these people are becoming adults and getting jobs and starting their own businesses. So it's not that everyone falls back, but it's a weird moment to ask that question because they're growing up. So it would be strange if the comparison group did anything but what it does.
Quick questions. What's the opportunity cost for the participants? I mean, what could they be doing otherwise apart from this business? Question 2, you motivated the whole presentation by saying that, there's a big boom in youth populations. Policymakers need to figure out how to get these people jobs. But there's only so many sausage stands and so many barber shops that you can have. So how does the study actually answer that big question?
Sorry. So the second question is, how do we answer the big question? We take a stab at it. We're asking, can this bring the youth into the labor force either through starting their own businesses or other ways? And by the way, this intervention doesn't only work by having people start their own businesses. Those are the statistically significant patterns in the long run. But in the short run, we also see people who start these salons thinking, well, I've got this 8 weeks of salon training. Maybe I should just get hired by an existing salon. And some young women do that. So we were trying something that we thought could get people into the labor force broadly. This doesn't answer the question completely, but we're hoping that ours is a piece of evidence that can contribute to the answer. What was your first question again?
What's the opportunity cost? Could
The opportunity cost. What else could they be doing? So most of these, and we were curious about that, there's not a rise in the fraction of people who have vocational training. And in fact, one of the things we thought, what if you give somebody a cash grant? What could you do with it? If human capital is the constraint, if the amount of skills that you have is the constraint and you getting a job, then spend that money getting those skills and join the labor force. And very few people do anything like that. We don't see almost any increase in the fraction of people who have vocational training in the cash arm as compared to in the comparison arm. But what's the counterfactual? The counterfactual is the comparison group. So there's a lot of data in the paper and in some of the slides I didn't show about all the myriad things that people are doing. So a lot of times they migrate up country to work with their family to take care of livestock. A lot of these people are working in homes, washing clothes, being house girls. A handful of them migrate to the Middle East to work as maids in the Middle East for 6 months, a year, 2 years. There's some unfortunate and colorful stories of the communications we had with some of them. So there's a lot going on. It's a dynamic. Education, not much. So these people have largely finished schooling. Maybe one more question, Sam, or two. Let's do the last two and then close the session. So go ahead.
I think it's nice to focus on kind of the survival rate of the franchise, because
we have some data
well.
about that,
yeah.
So I'd be happy to talk later. But I'd say that first, in terms of dumping on the sector, it's only like 20 or 30 businesses that get started in most of these places. And in comparison to the hundreds of them that are already there, we were very interested in this, and we actually have a separate data collection on the existing firms in the neighborhoods, and we don't detect anything like a drop in profitability that causes some of them to go out of business or anything like that. But very few firms are introduced in relation to the number that are in the market through this intervention. So that's part of why that is. And of those firms, it's typical that only 1 or 2 young women, they may start as a group of 8 or 10, but only 1 or 2 is involved in the firm even a few months later. So they're looking at this as an element in their menu of possible labor market activities. And then last question.
So given that you're not finding very much on income and a lot of the other sort of outcomes other than your probability of being self-employed, I'm wondering if you can't use this as an opportunity to try to see, well, what are the sort of maybe soft skills that are gained from...
This is a great question. So first of all, I'd say, even if we increase income for a year and no more, that could actually be a really cost-effective program, depending on how much it costs to do it and how much we increase the income by. So I think that still bears some reflection, and that's true for even these other short-term evaluations. So it's not to say that a short-term effect is not an effect. It is one. It's a question of whether it's the one that you wanted or the one that's actually cost-effective. In relation to soft skills, we actually have a tremendous number of measures of soft skills because the name of the program, if you remember, was the Girls Empowered by Microfranchise. So we have all these measures of self-efficacy, and we looked at all the papers from Liberia and Uganda that had previously shown effects, and so we coordinated with those authors and got some of those measures and put them in our surveys, and we don't see anything. So the short answer is we don't see a movement in soft skills, despite a really elaborate attempt, Big Five, using the 10-question or the 25-question module. We don't see anything like that.
So I guess my suggestion there would be, or at least to consider, that that's perhaps the most interesting finding in this paper. I mean, you're not finding the big long-term income effects. I think that speaks to some of the poverty trap stuff, and that's really striking. But here, I think a lot of people make the argument that, okay, entrepreneurship is terrific. You build all these other skills that you don't get when working for other people. There might be long-run differential outcomes and all that. And by really not finding that, I think you speak very powerfully to that debate.
So I think we need to finish cleaning the data before we sort of assert ourselves really powerfully on that debate and say there's nothing there for sure. But I appreciate the comment and look forward to showing you the paper when it's done. So thanks to all the presenters and thanks to the audience for sticking around for this great session. Thanks, everybody.